Claire Dawson dragged herself onto the bus just before the doors folded shut, her shoulders aching and her hands trembling from hours of scrubbing. The hospital cafeteria had been short-staffed all week. A co-worker was home with the flu, and until further notice, the workload had fallen almost entirely on Claire. Trays, pots, industrial sinks, she had washed them all, again and again, until her fingers felt numb and her wrists burned. By the end of her shift, even lifting her bag felt like a small victory. She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes as the bus rattled through the gray Portland streets. The rain streaked the windows, blurring storefronts into muted shapes. She tried to slow her breathing, to gather enough strength for what awaited her at home. The apartment would not be quiet. It never was after a family gathering. The night before had been Michael's birthday. Guests had filled the living room. Relatives, old friends, acquaintances who stayed longer than they should have. Claire had cooked all day after work, setting out dishes carefully, wiping counters until they shone, making sure everything looked presentable. She had gone to bed late, exhausted but relieved that the celebration was over. That relief hadn't lasted. Her mother-in-law, Evelyn Dawson, had inspected the apartment the way a supervisor inspected a poorly cleaned workplace. She had run a finger along the shelves, frowned at the tablecloth, and sighed loudly at the spread of food. "Is this really how you host people?" Evelyn had asked, shaking her head. Michael's birthday isn't a college potluck. There had been meat and fish, salads, appetizers, fruit, and dessert. Claire knew that, objectively, it was more than enough. But Evelyn's dissatisfaction had little to do with quantity. It never did. "And this cleaning," Evelyn continued, her voice sharp with disappointment. "I don't understand how you live like this. A good wife wouldn't leave things unfinished." Claire had stood there, hands clasped together, listening. She wanted to explain that she worked full shifts on her feet, that she did her best, that there was no dust on the floor and no stains on the counters. She wanted to say that exhaustion did not mean neglect, but she said none of it. When she had mentioned that she would finish tidying up the next morning because it was already late, Evelyn had reacted as if Claire had confessed to a serious moral failing. "A decent woman doesn't leave work for later," she had said, pressing a hand to her chest. "That's just wrong." The criticism had been relentless, delivered with calm certainty. And when Claire's voice had threatened to rise, Evelyn had reminded her, casually, almost kindly, that the apartment belonged to her. That Michael and Claire were living there because of her generosity. That reminder always ended the conversation. Claire stepped off the bus and walked the remaining blocks to the building, her pace slow. By the time she reached the apartment door, her back ached and her temples throbbed. Inside, the lights were on. Dishes waited in the sink, stacked neatly but unmistakably present. The smell of leftover food lingered in the air. Evelyn was no longer there. She rarely stayed long, but her presence remained in every pointed comment and every silent expectation. Claire set her bag down and stood still for a moment, gathering herself. She knew what needed to be done. She always did. She rolled up her sleeves and turned on the tap. As the water began to run, Claire felt the familiar weight settle in her chest, the quiet understanding that nothing she did would ever be enough, that her efforts would be measured, judged, and found lacking, that her place in this household was conditional, always one reminder away from being questioned. She washed the first plate, then the next, her movements slow but steady. She did not cry. She rarely did anymore. Instead, she swallowed her frustration, just as she had swallowed it countless times before. This was her life. Work that never truly ended, expectations that shifted without warning, and a home that never quite felt like her own. The apartment was quiet by the time Claire finished the dishes. The clock on the microwave glowed softly, reminding her how late it had become, but she ignored it. She wiped the counters one last time, then moved down the hallway toward the bedroom, telling herself she would at least straighten up before sleeping. The bedroom light revealed something that made her stop in the doorway. The carpet looked wrong. At first, she couldn't say why. It took a few seconds for her mind to register the detail that didn't belong. The pattern, an abstract design she had memorized over years of vacuuming, was facing the opposite direction. The darker edge that usually lay closest to the bed was now near the closet. Claire frowned and stepped inside. That carpet was heavy, thick, dense, and awkward to lift. Even shifting it slightly to mop underneath usually required Michael's help. She knew, without question, that she had not moved it herself. She stood very still, listening. The apartment was silent. No open windows. No signs of anyone else being there. Then she remembered. After the birthday celebration, when the guests had finally left and Claire had begun clearing plates, Evelyn had complained of being tired. She had said she needed to lie down for a moment and had gone into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. At the time, Claire hadn't thought much of it. Evelyn had stayed inside for nearly an hour. Why would she touch the carpet? The unease crept in slowly, like a chill that had no clear source. Claire set her cleaning cloth aside and approached the edge of the rug. She hesitated, then bent down and gripped the corner with both hands. It took effort, but she managed to lift it just enough to peer underneath. The floorboards looked ordinary at first. Clean, unremarkable. Then she noticed the faint marks. 2 narrow lines, slightly darker than the wood around them, as if something had been pressed there repeatedly. Claire lowered herself further, her heart beginning to beat faster. She ran her fingers along the marks, following their shape. They formed a rough rectangle. Her throat tightened. Carefully, she pressed down on one corner. A soft click echoed in the room. Claire froze, barely breathing. She pressed again, this time more firmly. Another click, louder. Then the section of flooring shifted, revealing a shallow compartment hidden beneath the boards. For several seconds she could only stare. Inside the compartment were several hard drives, neatly arranged and wrapped in thin, protective sleeves. They looked out of place, stark and industrial against the wood. Claire reached out and picked one up. It was heavier than she expected. Her hands began to shake. She lowered herself onto the floor, the carpet still half lifted beside her. Questions flooded her mind, each more unsettling than the last. Why would Evelyn hide something like this here? Why in Claire and Michael's bedroom? And how long had it been there? Claire tried to think logically. Evelyn barely used a smartphone. She complained about technology constantly. The idea that she owned multiple hard drives, let alone knew how to use them, made no sense. Unless she wasn't using them. Unless they weren't meant to be seen. A wave of fear rolled through Claire's chest. She felt suddenly exposed, as if the apartment itself had turned unfamiliar. She carefully returned the hard drive to the compartment, then replaced the others exactly as she had found them. With effort, she lowered the floor panel until it clicked back into place. She pulled the carpet over it, aligning the pattern as best she could. When she finally stood up, her legs felt weak. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to calm her breathing. Whatever Evelyn had hidden, there was not meant for her to find. And yet she had. The mystery sat between the floorboards now, silent and waiting. Its true weight still unknown, but already heavy enough to make the room feel smaller. Claire waited until the apartment was completely still before touching the carpet again. Michael hadn't called to say when he would be home, which only made her more anxious. She checked the hallway, the front door, the windows, an unnecessary ritual, but one that steadied her hands. Then she knelt, lifted the rug, and opened the hidden compartment. She took out one hard drive and carried it to the small desk in the living room, setting it down beside her laptop. The device looked ordinary enough, but it felt heavy in her palm, as if it carried more than data. Claire hesitated before plugging it in. She had never been particularly comfortable with technology. The hospital cafeteria required speed and endurance, not cables and settings. The first attempt failed. Her laptop didn't recognize the device. She tried another port, then restarted the computer, her impatience growing with every passing minute. When the screen finally lit up with a new folder, relief washed over her, quickly followed by dread. She opened the folder. Inside were dozens of files, carefully labeled by dates and initials. Video clips, audio recordings, images. Claire clicked on the first video, almost without thinking. The image sharpened into a private dining room. The camera angle was hidden, tilted slightly, as if placed discreetly on a shelf or behind an object. Two men sat at a table, leaning toward each other. Their voices were low but clear. They spoke about contracts, payments, and keeping things quiet. One of them slid an envelope across the table. The other nodded and tucked it into his jacket. Claire stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She opened another file. Different location, different men, same tone, same careful language that avoided specifics while making everything unmistakably clear. Money exchanged hands. Names were mentioned, companies, properties, accounts. In one clip, a man laughed nervously and asked if everything would remain confidential. A woman's voice, calm and familiar, answered from off-camera. Evelyn's voice. Claire's stomach dropped. She moved through the files slowly now, her earlier hesitation replaced by a cold, sinking certainty. Audio recordings captured conversations in cars, hotel lounges, private offices. Photographs showed men entering and leaving discreet locations. Timestamps embedded in the corners. The pattern was undeniable. These weren't accidents. They weren't isolated moments. They were evidence. Claire leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Evelyn had been collecting this material for years, methodically, patiently. She had placed herself close enough to powerful people to record them, to document their secrets. And she had kept it all hidden beneath Claire's floor. Blackmail. The word formed in Claire's mind, sharp and terrifying. She thought back to the way Evelyn carried herself. Confident, dismissive, untouchable. To the expensive jewelry she had begun wearing recently. The casual remarks about successful months and unexpected profits. At the time, Claire had assumed it was none of her business. Now, every detail took on a darker meaning. This was how Evelyn had lived. This was how she had maintained control, not just over her family, but over men with far more power and influence than Claire could ever imagine. Claire's gaze returned to the screen. She felt suddenly small, insignificant in the face of what she had uncovered. These were not harmless recordings. These were the kind of secrets that destroyed lives, the kind that people killed to keep buried. A sound in the hallway made her flinch. She glanced at the clock. Michael could be home at any moment. Panic set in, swift and overwhelming. She closed the folder, disconnected the hard drive, and sat frozen for a second, listening. The apartment remained quiet. Her heart continued to race as she carried the device back to the bedroom. She replaced it in the compartment, then returned for the others, working quickly but carefully, making sure everything was exactly as she had found it. When the last hard drive was hidden and the floor panel clicked shut, Claire lowered the carpet into place and smoothed it flat with trembling hands. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the rug, as if it might betray her by shifting again. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Did Michael know about this? Had Evelyn trusted him with the truth? Or was he as unaware as Claire had been hours earlier? And if he did know, what did that mean for her? Claire sank onto the edge of the bed, wrapping her arms around herself. The apartment felt different now, unsafe, as though the walls had absorbed what she'd seen and were holding it close. She made a decision then, not because it felt right, but because it felt necessary. She would not tell Michael, not yet, until she understood how deep this went, who else was involved, and what kind of danger this secret carried. Silence was her only protection. Claire lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of keys in the lock. Beneath the floor, the hard drives waited, quiet, hidden, and far more powerful than anyone in the apartment that night. The news came the next morning, abrupt and unreal. Michael stood in the kitchen with his phone still in his hand when Claire walked in. His face was pale, his expression oddly flat, as if the words he was about to say did not fully belong to him. "My mom's house burned down last night," he said. "There was a fire. They think it started late." Claire felt the room tilt slightly. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. The images from the hard drives, money changing hands, quiet voices, hidden cameras, rose unbidden in her mind. "Is she?" Claire began, then stopped, afraid to finish the question. "They haven't found her," Michael replied. "Firefighters searched what they could. No body. Nothing. Missing." The word echoed in her head even before he said it. Claire sank into a chair, her pulse thudding in her ears. The timing was too precise, too cruel. Just hours earlier, she had discovered Evelyn's secret life buried beneath their bedroom floor. Now the woman herself had vanished, leaving behind nothing but ash and unanswered questions. "Are they still looking?" Claire asked quietly. Michael nodded. "She's been listed as missing for now." For a moment, Claire expected him to sit down, to let the weight of it show, to grieve. Instead, he glanced at the clock on the wall. "I need to get to work," he said. "I'll call later if there's any news." She stared at him, disbelief creeping into her chest. "Work," she repeated. "Michael, your mother. I can't just not go," he cut in, irritation flashing briefly across his face. "There's nothing I can do, standing around here." He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Claire watched him go, her thoughts racing. She told herself that people reacted to shock in different ways, that numbness could look like indifference, but the unease refused to leave her. The day passed slowly. Claire went to work on autopilot, her hands moving through familiar routines while her mind stayed fixed on the same questions. By evening, there were still no updates, no sightings, no confirmations. Days followed, each one heavier than the last. Officially, Evelyn Dawson was missing. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the fire. Authorities said investigations were ongoing, but there were no leads to share. The search gradually lost urgency, the way all searches eventually did when there was nothing left to find. Michael grew quieter. He didn't speak about his mother unless Claire asked, and even then his answers were brief, vague. He came home late, ate little, and spent most evenings staring at his phone or going straight to bed. There were no tears, no visible grief. Claire tried to be patient. She reminded herself that people mourned in private ways. But every time she lay awake at night, listening to Michael's steady breathing beside her, the same thought returned. What if Evelyn wasn't dead? The idea crept into her mind slowly, fed by everything she had seen on the hard drives. Evelyn had enemies, real ones, men with money, influence, and reasons to want her silent. If she had sensed the danger closing in, what better way to disappear than to let the world believe she had perished in a fire? Claire imagined Evelyn slipping away before the flames consumed the house, leaving nothing behind but confusion. The possibility chilled her more than the thought of death itself. She looked at Michael differently now, searching his face for signs she might have missed. Did he know more than he was saying? Had he helped? Or was he truly as unaware as he seemed? The apartment felt tense, as though it were holding its breath. Beneath the floorboards, the hard drives remained hidden, silent witnesses to a life that had simply vanished. Claire understood then that the mystery had deepened. What she had uncovered was no longer just a secret, it was a threat. And whatever had happened to Evelyn Dawson, it was far from over. In the days that followed, Michael seemed to retreat further into himself. He spoke only when necessary. His answers clipped and distracted. Conversations that once filled the quiet spaces of the apartment now ended before they truly began. He came home late, avoided eye contact, and went to bed without asking how Claire's day had been. When she reached for him, he pulled away under the pretense of exhaustion. Claire told herself it was grief. Shock. The delayed weight of losing a parent without answers. She tried to give him space, to be patient, even as the silence between them grew heavier. Then one evening, as Michael shrugged off his jacket near the door, a scent reached her that did not belong. It was subtle, sweet, unfamiliar. Claire froze, her breath catching. The perfume lingered in the air, unmistakable once noticed. She stood there, staring at the coat in his hands, her mind scrambling for an explanation that didn't tear something open inside her. Maybe a co-worker, she told herself, a crowded office, an accidental brush in an elevator. But doubt, once planted, refused to stay quiet. That night, as Michael slept beside her, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of Evelyn alive behind the fence, the hard drives hidden beneath the floor, and now this. Each piece pressed against the next until the weight became unbearable. She needed to know the truth. Guessing would destroy her faster than certainty ever could. The next morning, an idea surfaced, one she had pushed aside before. Noah. Months earlier. While working in the cafeteria, Claire had befriended a young patient who often lingered after meals, complaining about bland hospital food. He had once helped her fix a malfunctioning card reader, explaining with a shy grin that he liked working with electronics. Before his discharge, he had told her to call if she ever needed help with anything technical. At the time, it had sounded like a casual kindness. Now it felt like a lifeline. Claire hesitated before dialing his number, her fingers hovering over the screen. Asking for help meant crossing a line she had never imagined herself crossing. But the alternative, remaining in the dark, felt worse. They met later that day. Claire explained as little as possible, her words careful and restrained. She didn't accuse Michael outright. She didn't mention Evelyn or the hard drives. She only said she needed to know where her husband was going, and that she needed to do it quietly. Noah listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once, his expression serious. "I can help," he said. From his backpack, he pulled out a small device no bigger than a matchbox. He explained how it worked, how it transmitted location data to an app on her phone, how it could be attached discreetly beneath a car bumper. Claire's stomach twisted as she listened. This wasn't who she thought she was, someone who tracked her own husband. But she accepted the device anyway. That evening, while Michael showered, Claire stepped into the garage. Her hand shook as she crouched near the rear of his car, fastening the tracker exactly where Noah had shown her. She straightened quickly when she heard footsteps, her heart pounding, but Michael never noticed. For the first few days, the results were uneventful. Michael drove to work in the morning. He returned in the evening. Occasionally, he stopped at a grocery store or gas station. Claire began to feel foolish, embarrassed by her suspicion. She told herself she would remove the tracker soon and forget the whole thing. Then she noticed a new pattern. Late one afternoon, the app showed Michael's car heading away from the city, farther than his office or usual routes. Claire watched the screen as the moved steadily toward the outskirts of Portland. An hour passed, then two. When Michael came home that night, Claire asked casually, "Long day at work?" He nodded, not looking at her. "Same as always." "You didn't go anywhere else?" she pressed, keeping her tone light. Michael's jaw tightened. "No. Why would I?" Claire said nothing more, but the lie rang loudly in her ears. The next day it happened again, and the day after that. Each time, Michael denied leaving work. Each time, the tracker showed otherwise. With every false reassurance, the space between them widened, filling with something cold and irreversible. Claire stared at the map on her phone late one night, her hands clenched tightly around it. Whatever waited for her at the end of that road outside the city. She knew now that the truth was no longer a matter of if, but when. Claire could not wait any longer. The tracking signal pulsed on her phone, steady and undeniable, leading her farther away from the city than she had ever followed Michael before. She took a taxi, giving the driver the address that appeared on the screen. Her voice calm despite the chaos tightening in her chest. The familiar streets of Portland slowly gave way to quieter roads, wider lots, and taller fences. With every mile, her sense of dread deepened. The car stopped in front of a large house set back from the road, surrounded by a tall, dark fence that blocked most of the view. Claire paid the driver and stepped out, the cool air hitting her face. The place looked private, deliberately hidden. Nothing like Evelyn's modest home that had supposedly burned to the ground. Claire approached the fence cautiously, peering through the narrow gaps between the boards. At first, she saw nothing, just a yard stretching toward the house, trimmed but oddly lifeless. A voice startled her. "You shouldn't go in there." Claire turned sharply. A boy stood a few steps away, thin and wary, his clothes worn and mismatched. He looked to be around 10 years old, his hands shoved into the pockets of an oversized jacket. "Why not?" Claire asked, her heart still racing. The boy frowned. "An angry old woman lives there. She yells a lot, chases people away." Claire swallowed. "An old woman?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, she's always mad. White hair. Never smiles." Hope flickered briefly in Claire's chest, fragile and desperate. That description didn't fit the image of a younger mistress she had been bracing herself to find. Still, unease crept in, heavy and persistent. "Does she live alone?" Claire asked. "I think so," the boy said, shrugging. "I don't like her. She scares me." Claire thanked him softly and turned back to the fence. She leaned closer, her breath shallow, scanning the yard again. Then the door of the house opened. A small figure stepped out onto the porch. Claire's vision blurred. Her knees nearly gave way. Evelyn Dawson stood there, very much alive. Her hair was pulled back, her posture straight, her movements brisk and familiar. She looked thinner, perhaps, and older somehow, but unmistakably herself. The woman who had been declared missing, possibly dead, stood calmly in the afternoon light. Claire's mind struggled to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. The fire, the search, the silence. It all shattered in an instant, replaced by a single, crushing truth. Evelyn had disappeared on purpose. Claire straightened, her shock giving way to a surge of anger and disbelief. She took a step toward the gate, ready to confront her, ready to demand answers. But before she could reach it, the sound of another car pulled her attention away. A familiar vehicle rolled to a stop near the house. Claire's breath caught as Michael stepped out. He was not alone. A woman emerged from the passenger side, young and well-dressed, her hand slipping easily through Michael's arm. They stood close together, comfortable, intimate in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. The world seemed to tilt. Michael laughed at something the woman said. His expression relaxed in a way Claire hadn't seen in weeks. He guided her toward the house, toward Evelyn, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. There was no doubt left, no room for excuses. Michael was having an affair. He had been lying, and he had been visiting his supposedly dead mother all along. Claire stepped forward, her voice breaking through the air before she could stop it. "What is this?" she demanded. Michael turned, his face draining of color. "Claire." Evelyn stiffened, her eyes widening briefly before narrowing with irritation. The woman beside Michael pulled her hand away, confusion flickering across her face. "How could you?" Claire asked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "All of you, do you have any idea what you've done?" Michael opened his mouth, but no words came. Evelyn said nothing, her silence cold and unyielding. Claire didn't wait for explanations. She turned and ran. Her chest burned as she fled down the road, sobs shaking her body. The betrayal was too much, layered, deliberate, and complete. Everything she had trusted had collapsed in a single moment. Footsteps followed her. "Wait," the boy called out. "Please." Claire stopped only when she could no longer breathe. She bent over, her hands on her knees, shaking. The boy approached carefully, his eyes full of concern. "Why are you crying?" he asked quietly. She wiped her face, forcing herself to speak. "Because someone I loved betrayed me." The boy nodded as if he understood more than he should. "Then he's stupid," he said simply. A bitter laugh escaped her through the tears. With nowhere left to go, Claire made her decision. She could not return to the apartment. Not after this. Not after everything she had seen. She turned away from the house, from her husband, from the life she had been clinging to, and walked forward, leaving her marriage behind, with nothing but heartbreak and a stranger's quiet kindness to guide her steps. Claire stayed with a friend that night, accepting the spare room without protest. Exhaustion pressed down on her, heavy and numbing, but sleep refused to come easily. Noah sat quietly on the edge of the couch, his knees pulled to his chest, watching her with careful eyes. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. Whatever had happened near that house had changed something in both of them. The next morning, Claire faced a practical problem she had no strength to overthink. She had to go to work, and she could not leave Noah alone. "I'll take you with me," she said after a long pause. "But you have to promise me something." Noah looked up immediately. "What?" "You stay where I put you. No wandering. No trouble," she said gently but firmly. "There are sick people there. They need quiet." He nodded quickly. "I promise. I'll be good." Claire brought him to the hospital cafeteria and settled him in a far corner, away from the main flow of staff and patients. She gave him a sketch pad and a handful of pencils, instructing him to draw and wait. He seemed content at first, hunched over the paper, tongue pressed against his teeth in concentration. Claire returned to work, her body moving automatically through familiar routines. Washing trays, serving food, wiping counters. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, replaying the image of Michael and the woman beside him, Evelyn standing alive and silent on the porch. She forced herself to focus. She needed the job. She needed stability, if only for the moment. Noah grew restless as the hours passed. The cafeteria quieted after the lunch rush, with fewer people around. The large room felt empty and dull. Noah's drawings lost their appeal. He began to wander, first slowly, then with growing curiosity, slipping through a side door and into the main hospital corridor. The hospital wing was alive in a way the cafeteria was not. Doctors and nurses moved quickly. Voices low but urgent. Gurneys rolled past. Machines beeped softly behind closed doors. Noah's eyes widened as he took it all in. He wasn't watching where he was going when he nearly collided with a man in a white coat. "Hey!" the man snapped sharply. "What are you doing here?" Startled, Noah stumbled backward. The man's tone, harsh and impatient, sent a spike of fear through him. Without thinking, Noah turned and ran down the nearest hallway. He ducked into the first open room he saw and slipped inside just as footsteps echoed behind him. The room was dim. A man lay motionless in the hospital bed, monitors humming softly beside him. Noah dropped to the floor and crawled beneath the bed, holding his breath. Moments later, the door opened again. Two people entered the room. Noah recognized neither of them, but he could see their shoes from where he hid. One pair was polished and expensive. The other wore narrow heels that clicked sharply against the floor. "This can't wait," a woman's voice said, tense and impatient. "You know what he's worth." "Mrs. Kingsley," a man replied carefully, "your husband is still alive. Legally, nothing can be transferred yet." Laura Kingsley's voice rose. "He's been unconscious for weeks. He may never wake up. I am not waiting indefinitely." The man, Noah later learned he was a notary, lowered his voice. "What you're asking for is illegal. Until there is a declaration, his assets remain." "I don't care about your laws," Laura snapped. "I want control of the company now. I'm his wife. It should already be mine." Noah squeezed his eyes shut, his heart pounding. The woman stepped closer to the bed. "He won't notice," she said coldly. "He doesn't notice anything." There was a pause. The room felt heavier, charged with something dangerous. "I won't do this," the man said at last. "You're asking me to destroy my career." Laura laughed softly, without humor. "Careers can be rebuilt. Missed opportunities can't." Footsteps moved toward the door. When it closed again, Noah waited several long minutes before crawling out from under the bed, his hand shaking. Later that evening, back at Claire's friend's house, Noah told her everything. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, as if afraid they might betray him. Claire listened in silence, her expression tightening with every detail. The next day, she spoke quietly with a nurse she trusted. The name Robert Kingsley was instantly recognized. "He owns a chain of hotels," the nurse said. "Big ones. He had a stroke over a month ago. His wife was here constantly at first. Then she just disappeared." Claire felt a familiar chill settle in her chest. Once again, power and greed stood over someone helpless. Once again, silence threatened to become complicity. And Claire knew, with unsettling clarity, that she was standing at the edge of another truth, one that would demand a choice she could no longer avoid. Claire began coming to Robert Kingsley's room after her shifts ended, once the cafeteria had quieted and her hands no longer smelled of disinfectant and steam. At first, she told herself it was temporary, just until she felt certain he was safe. But the visits quickly became part of her routine. The room was always dim, the blinds half drawn against the gray Portland sky. Machines hummed steadily, marking time in soft, mechanical breaths. Robert lay motionless in the bed, his face pale, his chest rising and falling with careful regularity. To anyone else, he looked like a man suspended between worlds, unreachable and unaware. Claire knew better. She wiped down the bedside table, adjusted the blanket when it slipped, and made sure nothing felt out of place. She spoke quietly to him sometimes, not about anything important, just small, ordinary things. The weather, a dish that had burned at work. Noah's stubborn insistence on feeding the stray cat behind her friend's house. She wasn't sure why she talked. Perhaps it was easier than sitting with her thoughts. Each night, she left with the same unease tightening her chest. Laura Kingsley's words, as Noah had repeated them, echoed in her mind. The cold certainty in her voice, the impatience, the willingness to wait for death if it served her interests. Claire could not ignore it. Days passed this way. No one questioned her presence. She wore a borrowed volunteer badge from her friend in nursing, moved carefully, and made herself small. As long as Robert remained unconscious, no one seemed to care who watched over him. Then, one evening, everything changed. Claire had just finished straightening the pillow beneath Robert's head when his hand moved. At first, she thought she imagined it, a reflex, perhaps, or the trick of tired eyes. Then his fingers curled suddenly, closing around her wrist. Claire gasped. His grip was weak, but unmistakable. She froze, staring down at him as his eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused, clouded, but undeniably aware. "Don't!" He rasped, the word barely audible. Claire shouted for help. Doctors and nurses rushed in, voices overlapping as they checked monitors and shined lights into Robert's eyes. Claire was gently pushed aside, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She watched from the corner as the room filled with motion and purpose. "He's awake," one of the doctors confirmed after several tense minutes. "We need to run tests. But he's conscious." Relief flooded Claire so suddenly that she had to sit down. Later, when the room had quieted again and the staff stepped out, Robert turned his head slightly toward her. His eyes were clearer now, though exhaustion still weighed heavily on his face. "You," he said hoarsely. "You kept coming." Claire nodded. "I did." "Why?" His voice held no accusation, only confusion. She hesitated, then pulled a chair closer to the bed. If she was going to say this, she would say it fully. Claire told him everything Noah had overheard. The argument, the notary, Laura's demands. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with restraint, aware of how fragile the moment was. Robert closed his eyes as she finished. "I knew," he said after a long pause. "Not everything, but enough." Claire looked at him, surprised. "I couldn't move," he continued slowly. "Couldn't speak. But I heard more than people realized. And I saw you." His gaze returned to her. "You sat here, cleaned, talked. I knew someone was making sure I didn't disappear, quietly." Emotion tightened Claire's throat. "When Laura realized I wasn't dying fast enough," Robert went on, "she stopped coming." The truth settled between them, heavy but unmistakable. Laura returned the next morning, dressed impeccably, her expression carefully arranged into concern. She stopped short when she saw Robert sitting upright, eyes open and alert. "You're awake," she said, her smile faltering. "Yes," Robert replied. His voice was steadier now. "And we need to talk." Claire remained in the room, silent. Robert did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He reminded Laura of their prenuptial agreement, of the clauses she had clearly forgotten. He spoke of the notary, of the timing, of the decisions she had tried to make on his behalf. With every word, Laura's composure cracked. "You misunderstand," she began. "No, Roberto interrupted. I understand perfectly." The room fell silent. For the first time since everything had begun to unravel, Claire felt something shift inside her. She was no longer just reacting, no longer merely enduring. She had stepped into a role she had never claimed before, one shaped by conscience rather than fear. And she knew, as she left the room that day, that whatever came next, she would not look away again. The memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and undeniable. The hard drives, they were still there, hidden beneath the bedroom floor of the apartment Claire had fled. The thought followed her through the night, refusing to let go. By morning, she knew what she had to do. Whatever leverage existed in this situation, whatever protection Robert needed, lay beneath that carpet. Claire returned to the apartment in the early afternoon, choosing a time when Michael would likely be at work. The hallway smelled the same. The walls looked unchanged. Yet everything felt distant, as though the life she had lived there belonged to someone else. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, listening. Silence. She went straight to the bedroom, closed the door, and lifted the carpet with practiced care. The compartment opened with the same familiar click. Relief steadied her hands as she removed the hard drives, sliding them into her bag one by one. She was fastening the zipper when the front door opened. "Back already?" Michael's voice cut through the apartment. Claire turned slowly, clutching the bag to her chest. Michael stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Come to beg me to take you back." She met his gaze calmly. The panic she had once felt nowhere to be found. "I'm here for my belongings." He laughed harshly. "Your belongings?" "Yes," she said. and to tell you I'm filing for divorce." The words landed between them, heavy and final. Michael's face hardened. "You can't be serious." "I am," Claire replied. "I don't want explanations. I don't want excuses. This is over." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, then stepped aside with an exaggerated gesture. "Take whatever you want, and get out." Claire didn't argue. She passed him without another word, her shoulders straight, her steps steady. She did not look back. Later that evening, alone in her friend's quiet house, Claire connected the hard drives to her laptop once more. This time, she searched with purpose. She reviewed files carefully, scanning faces and names until one video made her stop. Laura Kingsley's lover appeared on the screen, seated across from a man in a private room. The conversation was brief but damning. Clear admissions, a payment, an agreement to cover up a crime that would have destroyed both of them if exposed. Claire exhaled slowly. This was enough. The next day at the hospital, she waited outside Robert's room until Laura appeared, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Laura stopped short when she saw Claire blocking her path. "You again," Laura said coldly. "Move." "We need to talk," Claire replied. Laura scoffed. "You don't get to tell me what. Robert needs surgery," Claire said firmly. "Immediately." Laura's eyes narrowed. "That decision isn't yours." Claire reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She opened a video and held the screen toward Laura. The color drained from Laura's face as she recognized the man on the screen and the words he was saying. "Where did you get that?" Laura hissed. "That doesn't matter," Claire replied evenly. "What matters is what happens next. You will authorize Robert's surgery today. No dilas. No excuses." Laura's expression hardened. In one swift movement, she grabbed the phone from Claire's hand and smashed it against the floor. The screen shattered, glass scattering across the tiles. "There," Laura said breathlessly. "Problem solved." Claire did not flinch. "That was a copy," she said quietly. "The originals are backed up. Multiple locations." Laura froze. "If anything happens to Robert," Claire continued, her voice calm and unwavering, "everything I have goes to the authorities. And the press." The hallway seemed to shrink around them. Laura's bravado crumbled, replaced by something raw and desperate. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "I already have," Claire said. A long silence followed. Then Laura looked away. Later that afternoon, Robert was taken into surgery. Claire sat in the waiting area, Noah beside her, his small hand wrapped around hers. She watched the doors close behind the gurney, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with resolve. Hours passed. When the surgeon finally emerged, his expression was serious but relieved. "The procedure was successful," he said. "He's stable." Claire closed her eyes, the tension draining from her body at last. Robert survived, and as the hospital settled into its nighttime quiet, Claire understood something with startling clarity. Justice did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived calmly, carried by evidence restraint, and the courage to act when silence was no longer an option. Robert's recovery was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably real. The surgery had saved his life, but what followed mattered just as much. Physical therapy sessions replaced hospital monitors. Legal documents replaced whispered threats. Within weeks, he reclaimed not only his strength, but his voice. Laura Kingsley did not fight the divorce for long. Once Robert formally initiated the proceedings, invoking the terms of their prenuptial agreement and documenting her attempts to seize control of his assets, her position collapsed. The separation was swift, clinical, and quiet. There were no public scandals, only sealed filings, closed doors, and the unmistakable end of her access to power. Robert never spoke of her again. Claire's divorce followed a similar path, though for different reasons. Michael tried to delay it at first, claiming stress, complications, and unfinished business. Claire did not argue. She filed unilaterally, refusing meetings, refusing explanations, refusing the emotional negotiations he had relied on for years. When the final papers arrived, she signed them calmly, without hesitation. There was no reconciliation. There was no regret. As the months passed, the lives Michael and Evelyn had built through control and manipulation began to unravel. Evelyn's disappearance did not grant her safety, only isolation. Without leverage, without allies willing to protect her, her influence evaporated. The hard drives were destroyed, but the damage remained. People remembered. Doors closed. Invitations stopped coming. Michael, stripped of both marriage and certainty, drifted. The woman he had chosen left when stability vanished. Professional opportunities dried up. Nothing dramatic happened. No public downfall, no confrontation. Just loss, unfolding quietly, one absence at a time. Claire did not watch any of it. Her focus had shifted forward. She moved into Robert's home gradually, carefully, as though testing whether peace could truly last. There were no raised voices, no unspoken threats. Decisions were discussed, not imposed. When she disagreed with him, he listened. When she was silent, he waited. Trust rebuilt itself not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Noah became the center of their shared life almost without anyone naming it. He attended school regularly for the first time. He slept without fear of being sent away. He laughed freely, unguarded. When the legal process began, it felt less like a decision and more like a recognition of what already was. The adoption was finalized on a clear spring morning. Noah squeezed Claire's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white as the judge smiled and signed the final page. Robert stood beside them, steady and present, his voice calm when he spoke the words that made it official. Noah was no longer alone. Neither was Claire. Their wedding took place quietly, without spectacle. No luxury venue. No guest list padded with obligation. Only a handful of people stood with them, those who had shown up when it mattered. The ceremony was simple, held in a small garden just outside the city. Noah carried the rings. He walked carefully, solemn with responsibility, then grinned when he reached them. Claire watched him, emotion tightening in her chest, and understood something with absolute clarity. Family was not something passed down. It was something chosen, protected, and earned. Later, when the music faded and the guests drifted away, Claire stood beside Robert in the quiet that followed. There was no pressure to speak, no need to perform happiness. They already were. Weeks after the wedding, Claire sat alone in the bathroom, staring at the test in her hands. She read it twice, then a third time, before the truth settled in. When she told Robert, he said nothing at first, only held her carefully as if the moment itself were fragile. Life had not rewarded her for endurance. It had answered her honesty. As Claire looked at the life they were building, imperfect, real, and free, she understood that healing had never come from revenge. It came from walking away from cruelty, choosing dignity over silence, and believing that love, when chosen freely, could save what bitterness never would.